So something's been swimming around my mind for a little while, Nation. It's a debate that probably would have happened and did happen, but it didn't happen on YouTube a number of years ago. Back whenever, in the latter portion of the 1990s, first portion of the 2000s, nu metal was a hot piece of property. It was something where, if you were in a nu metal band during this time period, whether you were an upstart or one that had been pre-established for a couple of years, there was a good chance you were getting signed. It's very similar to the metalcore trend that occurred in the first part of the 2000s and the current deathcore trend that's going on currently. Of course, there's the emo core and everything like that, which also has kind of the same thing going on with whole labels being dedicated to this style of music. This is basically was just another one of those same little trendy properties, and what happened was that a couple of the real hard hitters in the genre were able to kind of help perpetuate it by gaining a little bit more power and gaining a little bit more influence. But that's not really why we're here. We're here to talk about whether or not nu metal was something that was really required in the heavy metal philosophy, the heavy metal history, or if this was something that we really easily could have done without, and we'd still be just fine today. Now, I know what a lot of you are probably going to say right off of the bat. A lot of you are probably going to say, especially since you're subscribed to my channel, that nu metal was a useless part of metal history. It was just a useless metal fad, something that was absolutely pointless and served no real purpose whatsoever. So, the whole entire world would have been better off without nu metal, because let's face it, everything that would have happened, or that has happened already, would have happened anyway. It was something that was already going on. The writing was already on the walls. Well, I'm going to take the other side on this one and tell you, once and for all, at least in my eyes, we needed nu metal. We needed nu metal in the whole heavy metal history in order for us to accomplish a couple of different things. In order for us to really have a little bit more of that staying power that perhaps was, we were a little bit worried about, and a lot of people were floundering about. A lot of people still consider metal to have been dead by the middle part of the 1990s, whenever all of us really realized here as heavy metal veterans that metal wasn't dead whatsoever. It was just a sleeping giant that was waiting to be awoken. It was something that was really, there was a lot of great bands that were going to influence the future and that were just releasing their first couple of albums and really just getting their legs together. What nu metal was able to give to us from really 1996 till about the first part of the 2000s, let's say 2002 to 2003 as the main era of nu metal, it was able to give a lot of individuals a little bit of a distraction from everything that was going on in the time as far as alternative rock was concerned, as far as the basic rock landscape was concerned, as far as what rap was concerned. It basically gave people who were clamoring for a harder edge on the radio something to listen to that wasn't necessarily an old Metallica song, an old Kiss song, some AC/DC, whatever it may be. At this time period, you have to remember, there wasn't very much that was being played that was of a heavier, more aggressive tendency. Pantera was definitely one that was getting some playback, mainly because they were one of the bigger bands during this time frame in which metal was supposedly dead. But there needed to be something a little bit more. Now, with bands such as Korn and Limp Bizkit and Disturbed and the like, those all started to come out and started to come through the woodwork. Then radio stations realized that they had something really kind of going on there. Whenever these songs started to be played, they were ones that were being requested over and over again. Basically, if you remember the time frame, we were right in the middle of a boy and girl group invasion with people such as the Spice Girls, NSYNC, the Backstreet Boys, Hanson, etc., etc. Alternative was definitely still doing well, but it was kind of one of those points where everything was starting to sound a little bit more like pop alternative as opposed to what alternative used to stand for in the 1980s and early 90s. It was becoming a little bit dulled down a little bit, and this was just a great era to influence a little bit more of the heavier edge. So whenever you have Korn and Limp Bizkit doing something that's a little bit different, that has a little bit more of an edge, a little bit of a punch to the teeth involved there, and involving a little bit of the whole hip-hop community, it's almost like a crossover idea. Something that had crossover potential that was going to bring over various different, affiliations of fans, and that's exactly what happened. What happened was that there was a large contamination of these fans that were able to come over and that were basically able to become infected by a couple of different core first wave bands. We're talking about your Korns, we're talking about your Slipknots, we're talking about Fred Durst and the Boys in Limp Bizkit. But then there's other bands that have already been trying to perpetuate this idea for a little while, such as the Stuck Mojo. And it's just something that really seemed to stick at this time, as opposed to whenever perhaps it was being done originally, a heavy metal type of rap project, with a little bit more of a metal edge, with the band Body Count. Of course, we saw it with Anthrax and Anthrax doing Bring the Noise, and we also saw a little bit of an attempt there with Aerosmith. but it's something that kind of happened a little bit more once we hit the 1990s. It was something that was going to happen and did. So with nu metal, why is it important? Why does it have any sort of importance? Yeah, we know. It was popular. It was something that was annoying as shit. It was everywhere. We had second wave bands that came through and they infiltrated the radio. We had bands that were in the first wave signing other bands such as Puddle of Mud or Stereo Mud. There's all sorts of mud. That's just mud right there. We had Videodrone, which had one hit or two hits. There's, of course, Static X that came through the lines, and there were others as well. Orgy came through and kind of added a different little spin to it, a different little edge, and that's kind of why it did have a little bit of staying power. Even though there were a lot of core attributes and core traits that were very similar, there were still just enough of a deviation for a culture that was kind of not as picky and choosy about what their music sounds like, was able to really, enjoy and really kind of see the differences. Those tiny little differences, those things that for us really don't feel like big differences at all. It just felt like more of the same with a little twinge. Those were massive for these individuals, so they were able to either love or hate these bands based around what that little twinge really offered. These were people that were becoming very infatuated with a unilateral sense of music, something that did not require a lot of difference, something that did not require a lot of harmonization, melody, and true difference of genre change, either that or any sort of real pitch shift or gravitational, intro song progression. Instead, this was something that had a bit of a message to him, was able to channel an emotion, typically one of rage or anger, either that or hopelessness, and they were able to do these songs and able to accomplish these messages in a shorter period of time than most modern metal was able to accomplish. You have to remember that at this time, some of the biggest bands in the world, such as Pantera and Metallica, were making a lot longer and lengthier tracks, and then you have to also remember that on the European edge, we were getting the rise of progressive death metal. Bands such as Opeth were producing 20-minute long songs with Black Rose Immortal in the middle part of the 1990s. So this was something that everybody was able to listen to on the radio and basically get behind. So, of course, based around that and based around the number of people that wanted to hear it again, this is something that took off. Now, why is this important and relevant? Isn't that something that just, once again, could be labeled as a trend? Well, consider what it did for some individuals. Consider what it did for me, for example. Right during this same period of time, that's whenever I was starting to get into heavier and aggressive music. And because of that, and because of hearing bands such as, Korn and Limp Bizkit on the radio, I knew that I wanted to listen to something that was a little bit heavier, something that had a little bit more to offer. I wanted more of the whole guitar side. I wanted something that had a little bit more punch to it, that had a lot more of a musicality sense to it. So, of course, I ended up with Metallica. Metallica, of course, took me to Megadeth, Flotsam and Jetsam, and the first real bands of metal that I really explored were Thrash. No, Opeth was not my first metal band. Neither was Iron Maiden, strangely enough. However, this is something that happened to a lot of different individuals, whether it be by their own accord in their own exploration, or because of a friendly push from a friend. That's something that my best friend and I definitely tried to do with a lot of different individuals. Kind of, enhance their scope a little bit and realize that, hey, if you like this, there's a good chance that you're going to like this even more because there's a little bit more to offer. And that's something that happened very, very often. Were there a lot of people that stuck with the same niche and still haven't gotten out of it now 15 years later? You're absolutely right. That's something that happens with anything. Some people really remain, glued with something that they were really, really close to, that had a lot of meaning and significance to them. It may be the reason why some of us are still metalheads and are kind of afraid to explore outside of the genre for anything else, even if it's something that just is slightly more melodic or slightly more pop-oriented. It's crazy how that works sometimes. Nu metal is definitely something that was required because it was an important part of musical history in getting metal a little bit more exposure. Sure, a lot of us probably will cite it as some sort of poser metal, either that or something that was not true metal. However, it was getting a lot of mainstream exposure. So heavy metal was starting to get some representation. It was starting to get a little bit of press time. And let's face it, with the individuals that we had, it was creating a little bit of a buzz. Not the same kind of buzz as, say, burning down churches or, planning to hit your wife. This was instead something that, well, for the time frame was a little bit more positive. They almost became iconic. It was kind of like what you see with, the pop punk guys today, where people were getting obsessed with guys from Slipknot finding Jonathan Davis to be hot and wanting to marry Fred Durst. Yeah, it was kind of creepy. It's kind of why I escaped that whole thing. But that iconic status was definitely something that helped. It gained some mainstream exposure to heavy metal. And because of that, a lot more kids were, well, understanding and knowing that heavy metal existed. And because of that, whenever the metalcore scene came a little bit directly afterward, well, consider it. It came right after nu metal. They wanted it not to sound very much like nu metal. They wanted it to be even harder than nu metal. They accomplished that task, and people went to metalcore, which was harder than nu metal. That's right, something harder than nu metal killed nu metal. And because of that, we are all very thankful. Would that evolutionary step not have happened if nu metal hadn't existed? Well, that's a good debate. Pantera is definitely one of the primary influences for metalcore. However, whenever you consider how long nu metal actually had a pretty sizable reign, if you take a look at it, this is definitely something that you could say probably would have been a little bit more slow to develop. Instead, this was something where metalcore immediately became the next big thing. You saw bands such as Killswitch Engage, Shadows Fall, etc. really accelerate themselves right into the mainstream, Lamb of God being another one. And that aggressiveness that was even more so than that of nu metal really attracted a subdivision. A lot of people that wanted something heavier than nu metal, they got that with metalcore. The people that thought that nu metal was just enough, they stuck around. So, what did we learn today? Was nu metal really all of that important to the whole heavy metal landscape? Yeah, actually it was. This is something that was absolutely essential, something that was necessary. At a time frame where heavy metal wasn't getting a lot of press and really a lot of attention, especially here in America, this is something that was needed and necessary in order to remind individuals that something like this existed, that heavy metal still existed. Sure, there were a couple bands that were still trying to hold the banner high, and they were trying to do their best, but at the same time, you have to also remember that a lot of bands underwent drastic transformations during this time frame. So this was definitely not a great era. To have that exposure still be there, even if it's in a format that seems a little bit more simplistic, radio-friendly, and dumbed down than the traditional metal that we're used to, hey, it was still some sort of presence. And presence alone sometimes is all that needs to be really done in order to motivate people to sway towards a genre. And that's exactly what happened with a lot of individuals. You now have a lot of individuals that do have some basic philosophy of metal. Even if it might not be the same philosophy of metal that we share, it's something that, well, it's present, it's there, and they do like something that has a hard, aggressive edge to it. Hey, they're not all listening to rap music, they're not all listening to Britney Spears, and they're probably only listening to Beyonce in their girlfriend's car. So, hey, cut them some slack, Jack. This is definitely something where nu metal was absolutely essential also because what the future might have became because of a hatred of nu metal. I just talked about the positive aspect because of metalcore, but because of the hatred of nu metal, we might have had some things that also came from that, Something that came a little bit further on. But the discussion now is turned over to you guys. Is nu metal truly essential? Was it something that was necessary? Was it something that, for the heavy metal history books, will go down in history as something that kind of brought a little bit of a faint light to a dark time in our fair genre, especially in the American landscape? Or was it something that was just a dumbed-down sub-process? Something that basically just existed to attempt to make money off of something that was bland, boring, three-chord nonsense? Let me know in the comments.